Well, good evening, everyone. Today, or tonight, I guess, tonight for me, because it's nighttime out, we're going to cover something a little bit different than what I've been doing. We've been doing a lot of Python scripting. I'm a firm believer in any programming language that each kind of has their pros and their cons. In this particular case, we had or I had a request from a client to build a script for some auditing that they were having in their Office 365 environment. So the idea was we needed a script that could go through and for each user in their environment, find out who the manager of that user was, which is an attribute within Active Directory for those users. And then for each manager, we needed to have a spreadsheet made for each of the users, for each tab, that would list every group that user was in so that they can audit and say, this user should be in this group or not be in this group, so on and so forth. So now that's a mouthful, but we will actually go ahead and just dive in the code. We're going to be in PowerShell today. Just going back to what I had said, it's really the right tool given all the investments that Microsoft has made from managing Office 365 and Azure. Really, PowerShell is wonderful. They have some great libraries and extensions, a few of which that we're going to use today, that make life a lot easier. Doesn't mean you couldn't accomplish this through other languages. It's just a lot easier to use what they have out of the box. So for starters, you're going to want to make sure that you have the Azure Active Directory mod installed on your box. And you can look that up online. Azure Active Directory PowerShell. If you Google that, you should be able to install the appropriate dependencies. So, for starters, we are going to use the connect Azure AD command. What that's going to do is that is going to allow us to type in credentials and administrative credentials for our Active Directory in Azure. What's nice about this command is it actually works with multi-factor authentication as well. So if your environment requires that you also receive the text messages or use the app to authenticate as an admin, you'll be able to easily do that through here with no additional lines of code. Very fantastic. So after we get our credentials, and we're going to be using that obviously throughout the script, the first thing we're going to do is we are going to get a list of the managers. Or we're actually going to make a list to hold our managers, which is just an array list. Now, typically whenever we're in PowerShell, you can make an array and specify, the size of that array statically. That's how a lot of things are made. In this case, since this is going to be a growing list, we're going to want to actually make an array that is dynamic that we can add to. So it's going to be a little bit different than what you might be used to seeing in PowerShell as far as arrays are concerned. So we are going to call system collections .array list, and then we are going to call our variable. Oops, let me close that out. We'll just call our variable here manager list @ and open, and that's going to actually allow us to call this variable, which will be an array list, a dynamic array list later on when we are appending objects into it. The next thing is let's just go ahead and get a list of users. Once again, system.collections.array list, and we will just call this user list. Very good, and close it out. So the first thing we're going to want to do is grab all of the managers, because we're going to use that later on when we're iterating through the list again so that we can build our Excel spreadsheets. Now, one thing to note, and one thing that I found through this process, was in this environment they didn't have a manager listed for every single user. So what that means is we had to have some kind of a process to capture those users and put them in a list with no manager assigned to it. So what we're going to do first is we're actually going to take our manager list and we're going to just add in a no manager option, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on. All right, so getting into the code, we are going to do just a standard loop here for each loop. We're going to just say our user in get Azure AD, and like I said, tab's your friend when you're on here. I know which one it is, but it's AD user. but feel free to use tab. We're going to pass a couple of additional commands here that I'll explain. For those of you not used to PowerShell or maybe new to programming, this is a variable that we are actually getting in our loop here. So we could call this anything we like. We're just going to call it user. But for every item that's in this Azure AD users, as we go through the loop, it'll actually, the user object that we have here will have all those attributes. The other things we're passing here, which is an important thing to note, is if you have a AD environment that's larger than 50 or so users, you're going to want to pass this -all attribute with true so that you actually get all the users. If you do not do this, you'll actually end up getting a subset of your users if you have any kind of size to your group. So then within our curly braces here, what we're going to do is we are going to make a user object. So we're just going to start building this user object. And actually, first, before we do that, let's do this. Let's go back here. So for each of these, let's just make a user object because we're going to want this if this user object does not have a manager assigned to it. We're going to want this outside of our if statements here. So we're going to make a user object. Then we are going to make an item, we'll just call it user manager, equal to another command here, get Azure AD user manager. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pass it an object ID that is the user object ID. Now, one thing to note, I'm tabbing right now, I'm getting nothing. This is actually a valid object for user, which we're creating up here from this function. If we were to run this code, you'd actually have kind of an IntelliSense field for that object. So you would have that available in a tab to see what's available. Since this is a fresh script, we're not going to see that, but just please note that that is an option in the future after you run this. So we have our user object, and then we have our user manager. So we're essentially going to go out for this user, and we're going to grab that manager object. Now we need to make a condition to check if our user manager is equal to null, then our user object, we're just going to build these strings essentially that we'll use later. We are going to have it as our user.object ID. There's a couple ways to do this. I'm just going to make just a pipe delimited string that we'll be using later and splitting it. You can do it however you would like. We're also going to get the user.displayName. Once again, pipe, and then we're going to say no manager. Just like we had above here, we're essentially just making this quote unquote false reference to a non-existent manager so that we can call it later on whenever we are building our spreadsheets. So if it's null, if it doesn't exist, we're going to build that object as such. Else, so it's not null, we want to do something a little bit different. We are going to take our user object this time, and we are going to make it into something very similar to what we have above, but we're actually going to pull in that manager ID as well. So user.displayName plus, and this time we'll actually have our user manager that we can use, and we're just going to grab its object ID. The object ID is the unique identifier within our Azure environment, so we'll be using those fairly frequently on here. The other thing we want to do is our manager list that we made right up here, right here. We want to actually put that manager name in that list because we're going to be iterating over that later on. We are going to add the user manager.object ID. Once again, we'll just put a pipe space, and let's go ahead and throw in our display name. Like I said, it's easier once you run it because you'll actually be able to see and autofill some of these items. Right now, since we haven't ran it, we're not going to see that. So we have our if, and we have our else. Very good. The last requirement that we have here is we have the user groups. So after we've grabbed the user information and also the user manager information and whether it exists or not, the next thing we need to do is get the groups for the users. So once again, we are going to make just a variable to hold our user groups. Once again, we're going to call another Azure function, AD user membership. So another very good function to use to easily get this information. Once again, we are going to pass it our object ID. Then we are once again going to iterate over this list, because this list is actually going to give you identifiers of the groups they're in, not the actual names, which isn't going to do us much good unless we have the actual name. So we're going to have to use that identifier here in a second to actually go to another Azure function to get the name. So once again, we're going to use our for each, and we're just going to say membership in our user groups that we just made. So for each of those, we are going to do something. Now, a few different membership group types do exist within Azure. I won't go into all of the different kinds. I'm just going to show you for this scenario and this request, the object type, which is what we're going to be keying off of, needs to be equal to group. There's other things it could be equal to as well. For our purposes here, it's just object type equal to group. So we're just making a note, only grab types that are groups. So conditionally, if our membership dot object type is equal to group, then we need to do something. So we have a group, we're in our user right now, we need to get the display name for that group. We're going to use another function, the get Azure AD group, and when you know it, we are actually going to once again pass an object ID to that function in order to remember, in order to get that name. So we'll get our object ID from our membership, which was here, and push that through. The next thing we want to do is we're going to take our user object and we are going to add to it. So we're going to make it equal to, we're going to make it equal to our user object. We'll add another pipe, and it all makes sense here in a bit why I'm doing it with the pipe. We're also going to add in the group display name dot display name, because that's an actual attribute that'll be in there. It'll give us the actual name of it. Okay, very good. So at this point, we have our memberships. We have our manager list. We have our users managers, if applicable, and we also have our memberships, and we have this nice object that'll be a pipe delimited file that from left to right would be the user object ID, the display name, the manager name, the manager name, and then it would have after that any group. So if we think about our placements of our string, the first couple of objects, the first 3 or 4, are all going to be specific to that user and its identification, and then after that it will all be groups. So now that we have our user object complete, we are going to add to our user list our user object. Very good. And make sure, like I said, on our curly brackets here, we're outside of our for each, there's our if, so we should be going up here to our outer loop, or outer for each loop that we have here. Very good. So now at this point, we should have a distinct list of our user attributes. We should have a non-distinct list of our managers. The next thing we need to do is we need to start thinking about our Excel creation. So in order to do that, here above, you've seen that we had our manager list, we added to it. Well, most of these users might have very similar managers, so this list is really going to have redundant copies of those managers. So the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure the list is unique. Pretty simple to do within PowerShell. In fact, it's just a simple command we can run after the fact or while we're doing our iteration here. So we are going to do a for each. We're just going to make this, this variable, we'll just call it M, in our manager list. We're going to pipe and get dash unique. And that's as simple as it is. It's actually going to give us the unique manager name within that list. So we just really took a list that's probably rather large and we made a much smaller list of items that are unique here. If we would like, so as we're going through this list, if we just wanted to see what that looked like, we could simply do an echo M, which I'm going to do just for the case of displaying here. So this is just, like I said, just going to show you this, unique list that we have. We can also do the same thing, like I said, with our users. So I'm not going to put our echo in there right now, but you can just use that, like I said, later on if you would like. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make our spreadsheet. Now you're going to want to make sure that you have Excel installed on the computer that this is running, or the server this is running, because it is going to be calling that object library, that Excel application library. So first we need to make an object. We'll just call it Excel just to be simple. We'll just say new object. It's a com object equal to, just let me actually, there we go, equal to Excel dot application. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to say that this guy is in fact visible. We want to see it on our page here. So now mind you, this is making a new object for each manager in the list, right? So every time I go through our managers on this list that are unique, we're going to be making this Excel object. So we're going to want to make sure that we save and quit that object at the end. So just food for thought. So for each manager that we have, we want to go ahead and make a workbook. We'll make that equal to the Excel dot workbooks dot add. Very good. And then we are going to iterate over the user list where the manager equals the manager we are currently on. So we're going to take that list that we made previously and we are going to split it out. We're going to get that manager identification. We are going to compare it to the manager we're on. If they are in fact the same, we are going to put it in this spreadsheet. So once again, for each, we'll just make a variable named u in our user list, because that's the next thing that we are working through. And then we just need a conditional statement here. So if u, which is going to be this string that we made up here, so if u dot split, so we're going to be using some string functions here, just like we did in some of our Python exercises, but just in PowerShell here. So if split 2, so this will, once we split that strings by pipe, that's actually going to make us a nice array to work in. We're going to call object 2, which is really object 3 in the list because we start at 0. If you recall up top here, 1, 2, 3, 3, here's our manager name. That's what we're grabbing here, even though it is calling 2. That'll actually be the third item. So if that is equal to our M object, which we made up here, which is in our manager list that we made. So if it's equal to it, once again, the same functionality, split, we're going to call position 0 on this one. So if it is in fact equal to that, then we need to do something. Once again, not to get too confused here, when we made this manager list above, where's that at? Where's that at? Manager list. This and this are the two items that we have on this manager or on this manager list. So whenever we're wanting to actually compare our manager display name, which actually I might have that written wrong there. Let's see, M split, which would be our object up here, manager list, object ID. Okay. Just trying to think through this here. So if our manager list, which we have here, no manager, we have our display name down here. Sorry, just bear with me for 1 second. Split 2, 0, 1, 2. Oh, gotcha. Because we're getting the object ID, and we have the object ID up here as no manager. Okay, sorry, I was just making sure. So in theory, what this is going to do, this list that we have will actually have our object ID along with our display name. So if that item split, so up top, whenever we made no manager, it split on a pipe, 0 is actually going to give us this, which is exactly what it will be here. So we're in good shape. I just made that a little bit more confusing than it needed to be, so my apologies. So back to the code. If those two are equal to each other on those lists, then what we want to do is we want to create the sheet for the user, because each user is going to need its own sheet. So we're going to make an object, we'll just call it worksheet. We are going to make it equal to our workbook that we have. There's a worksheets item in there that we can call. We are going to add, so essentially we're adding a worksheet to the workbook here. Then we are going to call it. So, you know, whenever you are working in Excel and you have the tabs at the bottom, that's essentially what we're doing here. So we're going to give it a name, and we are going to give it the user attribute, so the U variable that we have here, split. We're going to split it once again on a pipe. And position 1, because position 1 is going to be that user's display name. So that's going to give us a nice name that we can work off of. And then after we have the name, we're going to want to add in the group, the groups and the group header. So for every group, right, so this user could have 1 to n number of groups, or even 0 groups for that matter. We're going to want to make this sheet dynamic enough so that we can say group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, so on and so forth. So we are going to add in the groups at this point on that particular sheet. So first we're going to just make a variable named I that we're going to make equal to 1 that we'll use here in a moment. We're going to say for each, we'll just make another variable, G in our user attribute split, or our user variable split. So for each item in there that we split out, so we'll have several in there with the groups that we have as well, we want to do something. So first, we already know that the first 3 are either the user information or the user's manager's information. So we want to skip those if that's the case. So we're going to use our variable I here again in a minute, but for now we're just going to say if I is greater than 3, we want to do something. So we are going to use worksheet cells. So this is us actually working in the cells themselves. So if you think about it, think about the cells on a worksheet. If we were at position 1, 1, you'd be in the top left. 1, 2 would be kind of column 2, I guess you could call it, so on and so forth. And then, so if this was 2, this would essentially be row 2. So we're going to start with row 1 because we're going to need our header telling us which column we're on. Since we are keying off of this I attribute, we're going to be increasing it here in a moment. So that -3 is going to make much more sense. And we're going to set that to group number plus I minus 3. So essentially we're going to tell it what group number we are on. then the next thing we need to do is actually put in the group information, because that's just essentially giving us a header, more or less. So we're going to go down one row once again. I minus 3, and we're going to make that equal to G, because G is actually going to be the name of the group that we split out here, because that's the user that we have. So once we get past the first 3, everything past that should be groups. We're going to make that equal to G. All will be good. After our condition, so if we're just iterating over here, we are going to increase our I by 1. So I plus plus. Very good. So at that point, we are going to increase I every time we get past the first 3. This puts us on just adding the groups to those cells. We're minusing 3 because we've already went through 3 here that we're skipping for those user and manager attributes, so that we're only going to get the groups in question here. So now that we have all of that, let's check our curly brackets. We got out of our user list, but we're still in our manager list, which is great. Now that we've got all of our users, we want to go ahead and finish out our workbook. So I'm just going to do a save as, and let's do users. I'm just going to put it here on my desktop. We're going to give it just a valuable name here. Once again, we will make it our M variable that we have up top here. Let me see where that's at. Here we go. So our manager's list, so we want to make it the actual name of the manager. Once again, we're going to use that split function. We're going to grab position 1 after splitting it, so that would be our placement in the array. And then we're going to say XLSX, like it's in Excel. So that saves our book. The next thing is we want to make sure that we quit this. Now, if everything goes as planned, when we run this, we should end up with several sheets that has this information. So let's cross our fingers and hope that I typed in everything all right. So we're going to run this. It's going to prompt us for our Azure AD authentication. So I'm going to type in mine. And I do have multi-factor turned on, so I'm going to get a text message that tells me I need to put in here. Very good. Okay. So we're going to let this run, see if we have any errors. We might have, in this given group, get user membership. So I might have typed in something incorrectly here. Let's see here. Get AD. Let's just see what our error is. Can't be found the accept argument. Object ID. Of course, something I do all the time is I put spaces into areas where I do not need to have spaces, and that is what happens. So once again, I could have actually commented out and used my existing session for this. Make sure I do that again if we end up having to rerun this. So we'll get my code. Very good. Awesome. So I'll let that run here. Here in a second, we're actually going to start seeing Excel pop up once our list is completed here. So I'm going to pause this video and we will be ready. So welcome back. Just to show you kind of the output, I didn't want you to have to see it going through everything. Just a brief example of, a manager. The name is on our Excel file, and some users who report in along with each group that they're in. So as you can see, dynamic on our group. Like I said, once again, pretty good script, maybe hopefully a useful script for you to do. Lets you kind of get your tiptoe into the Azure PowerShell environment. It's very powerful. You can do an awful lot. A couple different ways to do this too. We did some strings that we split out. If you wanted to make actual predefined objects, you could do that as well. This is just a short and quick, easy way to do it as well. So I hope this helps. And as always, have a good night. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. You can email me at magnumdampier.com with any questions or requests you may have. Thanks and have a good night.